Okay, with this presentation, we're going to start talking about what happens as a result of Alexander III and his reign, the breakup of his empire, and the resulting Hellenistic culture that spreads throughout much of the known world. So that's what we're going to focus on. We're really going to focus on what happens immediately after Alexander the Great's reign and then ultimately his death. This idea right here of Hellenization, this process of blending Greek, Persian, Egyptian cultures and spreading it to all these areas is really going to be Alexander's lasting legacy. It is not going to be the empire that he forges. Upon his death, what we get are new kingdoms being formed on Alexander's death. This whole big empire that he went out to conquer is not going to stay together. Now, first bullet point here. They're often at war with one another until being conquered by the Roman Republic. That is true. You basically have it being divided up amongst his generals. Now, his generals have been marching for 6+ years, and they see upon the death of Alexander an opportunity to gain even more land and territory than what was originally agreed upon when Alexander died on the return trip home. What they create here are large bureaucracies. They're richer classes, they gain more influence. This is going to have an impact on not just the government, but also the economy. We start to see less and less middle-class farms, and we start to see large farming systems take root. Almost, you'd call them even plantation systems. And we have a shrinking middle class in many cases in these large bureaucracies. Remember, every point here is sort of a general overview. You're going to have a lot of individual variation depending on which kingdom you happen to be in, because it, once again, is divided up amongst the generals. You have a large amount of shifting alliances and power on a much larger scale. And what I mean by larger scale is previously it was done by city-state in Greece. Now we're covering it in a lot bigger area. You're covering Greece, you're covering the Middle East, you're covering North Africa, Persia, Southwest Asia. It's on a much larger scale. It's often devoid of previous democratic ideals. The important thing, though, with this and to make note of is the fact that these democratic ideas are going to survive. These manuscripts are not going to be lost to history. We're still going to read Plato, we're still going to read Aristotle, we're still going to read a lot of the even new Hellenistic philosophies that come about later on. Most of the time what we see as far as the governments are concerned, brought about by these military generals, is a monarchical or some other form of divine rulers, especially in the western areas. In the east, you don't see that as much, and of course, but in the east you don't see as much infighting and quarreling as you do in the west. And you're going to see this on the map. You can sort of see why there's much more bickering and quarreling in the west than there is the east. In the west, you have all of these different groups and all of these different kingdoms that are divided up. And as a result, they're going to fight. They're going to be looking for more land, more title. Remember, we're talking about the Mediterranean Sea here. We're talking about one of the most important areas in the world when it comes to trade, sharing of ideas, sharing of culture, sharing of money is the key. And so we're going to have a lot of infighting. This grand scale idea of Alexander had of uniting the world and blending of culture and all these ideas that he's professing, at least on the surface, as he's going out and conquering all these areas, it's really not going to come to fruition for him. Now, just like the Mycenaeans, these guys are going to turn on each other. We're going to largely see the dissolution of what would have been Alexander's empire. We are going to see, as an interesting consequence of this, the return of important women as Hellenistic rulers, which of course you didn't get in, say, archaic age Greece. Olympias of Macedonia, Alexander's mother, is going to take charge in that area. And you have the importance of Cleopatra of Egypt, who is later on going to manipulate both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony of Rome into establishing herself as an important ruler in that area. Kings have increased power. They're typically Greek. They do allow some democracy, but this democracy is at a local level. It's not the great Acropolis in Athens where we see democratic principles being practiced. It's more or less in the countryside and small communal areas that we would see that. But of course, the king at any time could come in, move in, and destroy it at his or her discretion. The lasting impact of the development of democracy for Greece is not necessarily what it does for the Greeks. The lasting legacy of democracy that develops in Greece is more or less for what it will do for the Romans. And then the Romans are going to go out and conquer much of Europe, and these democratic principles are going to spread there. They're going to spread back into the Middle East in the Byzantine Empire. They're going to stay in the Mediterranean and eventually influence a lot of the modern developments of democracy, of ideals, of rights of man that we're going to see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. We too often want to measure sort of the immediate impacts of some of these ideas, and it's tough to do. You're really going to have to see the influence of Plato and Aristotle throughout the course of this entire year, really. We're going to be going back to the some of these important philosophers that we talk about with ancient Greece. As I mentioned before, with the large bureaucracies of almost the re-rise of the aristocracy that used to be in Greece, is you're going to see agriculture and industry on a much larger scale. These large estate system develops. Now, this means it's a negative for middle-class farmers oftentimes. We see more of a reliance on slavery in these large estates. However, there is a need for bankers and financiers for trade. Part of what Alexander is going to do is he's going to open up a lot of new markets within these kingdoms. You're also going to have shared crops, shared technology. This whole idea of Alexander bringing in with his military various groups and having them continue the fighting style that they were used to instead of having them to rigidly adopt something that they wouldn't be good at. You're going to see that with the farming as well. You're going to see a lot of new crops circulate in areas that you typically wouldn't see them. You are going to see some development of Hellenistic cities. The Seleucid kingdom is going to have the most growth overall. I'm just skipping back to the map really quick. The Seleucid kingdom is this area in, well, on here, on your paper, it's going to be in some sort of gray color, but it's in this ugly puke orange. These are the areas of Mesopotamia, particularly. We're going to have a large development of cities. Remember, Babylon was supposed to be Alexander's capital. So let's go back to that slide here. Hold on one second. The only exception where we see more growth in city development other than within the Seleucid kingdom is Alexandria, Egypt. They are controlled by the Ptolemaic. It is part of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Alexandria, Egypt has about 500,000 people in it. That's huge for ancient era. Alexandria, and this is very important, is going to be a center for Hellenistic culture. There's going to be great libraries built. There's going to be great new architecture being built. The lighthouse of Alexandria is a great example. This huge towering lighthouse that would actually guide ships in using reflective mirrors and the fire that was built. It's going to be a center for study. People are going to flock to Alexandria to go and study. It becomes almost a major university in and of itself. And what Alexandria does, even though sort of Greece doesn't have it anymore because of this monarchical rule, it is going to preserve a lot of the manuscripts. So a lot of the great thinkers, whether it be philosophy, the great playwrights that we've talked about, the great scientists that we've talked about, the great mathematicians, even the ones that we don't mention, I mean, there's literally hundreds and hundreds of these guys and lots of writings on them. You can find them in Alexandria. The Alexandria Library was a crown jewel within this Ptolemaic kingdom. It really was. It was the city founded by Alexander. Of course it would have this great stature. Many of the old Greek city life amenities are also exported. Alexandria has them. ideas of the central marketplace of the agora, ideas of the villas that people were living in, the nice housing, the stone columns. All of this is going to be transported throughout the Mediterranean. So we have in Alexandria and other areas, we have libraries and scholarship develop, teaching as an important profession. You also have the growth of professionals, whether they be mathematicians, whether they be scientists, doctors. You have that growth of a professional class instead of just, okay, we're going to be kings or aristocrats or merchants or poor farmers and slaves. You start to see a professional class develop in some of these Hellenistic areas. You also have Koine. It is the common Greek language. Remember, individual city-states, you have the Greek alphabet, you have the Greek language, but you have several different dialects. We start to see a more common dialect emerge. What we're going to focus on starting in the next presentation, and we'll finish it up here on this one, is there's a new spirit in art, frank realism. The depiction of a scene, not just, if you think back to the standard Koros, the male statue of the archaic age where they're just sort of standing there posing in this perfect form. We're going to start to see action. We're going to start to see almost like an action photograph, almost like if you want to relate it to something, almost like that really cool action movie poster that just sucks you in where there's a lot going on. And you'll see that in the next presentation. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Part 2 is next.